Hello everyone, let's get started. I'm Bobby Sand, a professor here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. It's still hard for me to say that. And the founding director of the Center for Justice Reform. And I am very pleased to introduce Professor Kathy Fox from UVM, and she will tell you a little bit more about her work, and Public Philosophy Week.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm a professor of sociology at UVM and a criminologist, and I mostly study corrections. And UVM hosts Public Philosophy Week, and there's a bunch of events in Burlington, and they wanted a few events elsewhere, not in Chittenden County, and asked if we would do this one here. And it's great to get people from the law school as the audience, so this is great. And so we will get started, but the topic today, as you well know, is should we abolish prisons? And we are going to start off, Judge Sand will be weighing in on something in a few minutes, but you should have a case in front of you that you need a few minutes to read, and then we will be asking for you to write down what you think the appropriate sentence is. At this point, did you do that? Yes. No?
No.
No, sorry.
Follow the judge's directions.
So sorry. Okay. All right. Do you need a minute to read it though? Yes? Yeah, okay, all right. Well, let's do that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's okay.
And I guess as you're finished and ready, if you raise your eyes, we'll get a sense of that most people are ready. So we'll wait until we see that. Okay, it looks like most people are pretty close to being done, so all rise for the Honorable Court, Judge Robert Sand presiding.
Please be seated. So we are here today for the sentencing hearing in the case of State versus Jones. Mr. Jones was charged with second-degree murder. He has entered a guilty plea to that charge, but there's no agreement about what the outcome should be. And so we are scheduled for a contested sentencing hearing. Under the law in this jurisdiction, the court may sentence him to any sentence up to life imprisonment. And there are no mandatory minimums. There are no presumptive sentences. It's simply a blank slate from 0 to life. Counsel, thank you all for being present. Feel free, and I open this up, what are some of the salient or important facts that the court should keep in mind before imposing sentence based upon the scenario that you have? Please feel free to raise your hand and speak loudly. And don't be shy. says the court. What's one important or salient fact?
Jones did not have a history of violence toward anyone else.
Thank you. Anything else?
This was not random, it was his father.
What else is important?
Well, speaking of the father, Mr. Jones was subject to physical and emotional abuse by the father as well as other members of the household.
They too were subject to abuse,
Correct.
okay? What else?
No priors.
No prior criminal history. Keep them coming. Sorry, I don't think a judge would say it quite like that. Counsel, what else is relevant, important, salient?
That he's precluded from the defense of insanity.
Say it again?
His defense can't be insanity.
He was found sane, that is not contested. And let's keep in mind, he's entered a guilty plea, so the merits have been decided. All that's left is sentencing. Anything else? Put on your prosecutor's hat.
Oh, no.
It fits you so well, Professor Brown.
No, I always have my defense hat on. And with that hat on, I was gonna add that he is like a young adult working person who I believe helps to financially support his family.
Okay. Anything else that a sentencing judge needs to keep in mind?
Before Jones shot his father, there was a fight between the father and the mother, and the father shoved his mother onto
Yes.
the couch.
Okay.
He has a history of drug use.
History and ongoing. Yep.
I was gonna say that, but also that this was clearly intentional.
This was an intentional shooting. Let's not forget, he's been convicted of second-degree murder, one of the most serious charges under the law. Any other thoughts?
The prison may or may not be set up to help him with his problems, which he definitely has.
Okay. We will definitely revisit that issue. Okay, so in light of all of that, all of those factors that you have offered, it is hereby the sentence of the court that Mr. Jones, you know what? By the power vested in me, I hereby appoint each and every one of you as the sentencing judge. And here's what I'd like you to do. It's really hot in robes. This is the main reason I did not become a judge. What I would like each of you to do is take a note card. This is going to be anonymous. If you were the sentencing judge, how much time as an initial matter, so not supervision after release, not probation, not parole, how much time would you as the judge sentence Mr. Jones to for his conviction for second-degree murder? And let's go in 6 months increments. So you could go 0, you could go, let's say, 99 years. So all that needs to be on the nice blue piece of paper is a number. The amount of time you as sentencing judge would impose as an initial matter on Mr. Jones for second-degree murder. All right, and when you do, if you could turn them numbers down and pass them to one person at your table, please.
Oh, yeah. Zero. Oh, nice.
Decide.
Chris, how are you? It's just making so sick.
Questions? I saw words.
Yeah, there were no
What's that? My favorite sign that I saw. When I was asked one word to describe myself, I said, can't find words. There you go.
Are certainly not as high stakes.
Yeah.
So it's been, but I feel like he's pretty much lost it.
Same here.
I'm also not.
They know it's not fine.
Anyone else?
Just enough.
Just.
I was.
Thank you. Very good. Any more? Mr. Fox.
Super interesting. Should I go through all of them?
No, one.
Just
And then I'll
one.
go.
Just 30 years.
It's either 0 or 1.
1 year,
5 years.
0,
7 years.
3 years,
5 years.
1.5 years,
0.
2 years,
3 years.
0 months,
And yours.
25 years.
2 years,
6 years.
10 years,
5 years.
10 years max,
0.
0,
10.
6 months,
30 years.
0,
15 years.
2 years,
10 years.
4 years. That's all.
2 years.
Oh, and I have one that says deferred.
And 3 years. Okay, so what was our range? 0 to
30.
30 years.
Nobody said life.
That's true. So, regardless of what you said, well, first of all, any thoughts, reactions, or comments to either that exercise or the range of outcomes?
I guess I can only speak for myself, but I don't have a degree in psychology or any of the associated human sciences to decide what this person needs.
And do you think judges do?
I wish they did.
Yeah, okay.
There's a gentleman,
I'm sorry.
it's hard.
Otherwise, that's what okay. So I think for me, like it's been when looking at the data specifically, it was very much outrageous to find out that there was more than 15 people that said 0 months. At the same time, also, I do believe that I wish the justice system was taking this into account, given the facts of providing. Because the way I thought about the way I chose, for instance, was the fact that whenever a young person goes to jail, since he has no criminal background, he has no affiliation to no gangs, he has no affiliation to no criminal system. If he goes into it, he's going to have to affiliate with the criminal system. And now what happens is he's going to get into a gang, come back and start recycling back and forth. Remember, this is a young person, so his life can be saved again. So I do not believe the jail system is probably the most appropriate path to educate him, but probably must be something else or alternative.
And we'll definitely talk some more about that. All right. Regardless of what you said, I'm going to shut the door. What are some reasons to punish Mr. Jones harshly? So regardless of what you specifically gave or what you wrote down, what are some reasons?
He committed an intentional killing of another human being.
Okay. And that's something that society should not permit.
That's something that so far society has said is not.
Okay.
But the deterrence effect of other future crimes, but coming up with a number felt kind of arbitrary, so you gotta ask the question, what other social interests will be served with any of these?
Excellent. Okay, we're gonna loop back.
I think there wasn't anything in this background that talked about him calling for help, and that being the first method of action.
So self-help. And that's a reason to punish him?
I think it expands upon trying to protect against who you're protecting against now. I think that's trying to protect against society.
Other thoughts?
Because we know prison is such a good deterrence. No one else will ever commit a crime now.
Do I detect just a pigeon? Okay, so let's flip it. What are some reasons not to punish him harshly in the form of incarceration?
Just to get treatment and to help him get the help that he needs. I mean, a lot of the times you may or may not get that within the prison that you're assigned to.
Okay.
Punishing him won't solve the problem. It'll just be a stopgap. So there may be future moments when he feels enraged and doesn't have the skills to deal with that and ends up taking another life. So the important step is to address the root cause and not the general outcome.
If you do imprison Jones long-term, you're effectively removing a productive member of society because he's going to miss out on pretty much all of his formative adult years and have no clue how to re-enter society, particularly with the way that our prison system is set up now.
It was an isolated incident, the result of prolonged and continuous abuse, so reoffense is unlikely.
Let's come back to that. I wrestle with that. And if you compare the sort of self-help aspect of this to the one-time event, but good point. Another comment and then we'll move on.
Because he was the sole provider of that same family that was affected, I mean, essentially you can argue that he was protecting himself and everyone else, but you're taking him out of the equation that everybody's gonna suffer in that family now.
Okay, so keep in mind, the very first comment looked back in time to the event and said he committed murder. And that's classic retributive theory or retributive philosophy. Bad deeds, criminal behavior deserves punishment. Regardless, says a pure retributivist, regardless of what the future result is. This concept of just desserts, which I thought was just a meal of sweets until I realized that it's from deserved, not dessert as it, never mind. Okay, and some of you are looking to the future to create a benefit through the outcome. And that's the utilitarian notion of punishment. Deterrence, both specific or individual and general deterrence. Utilitarians also believe in rehabilitation and incapacitation. So surprisingly, incarcerating people can serve a utilitarian function if someone poses an ongoing threat. Now, we've already had some comment about deterrence. Professor Fox, any thoughts about deterrence and its value in our system?
Yeah, lots of thoughts.
Okay.
So, many people overestimate the extent to which deterrence works. So deterrence has three components, which is severity, certainty, and swiftness. And only certainty has any impact. And so, and what that means is, if someone was absolutely certain they would get caught and punished, then they are more likely to be deterred. But only half of crimes are reported, half of those are solved. People make calculations about the likelihood of getting caught. Everybody sitting in prison probably thinks they weren't gonna get caught, right? There's even Janet Reno, former Attorney General, said that there's no evidence that deterrence works. So I would argue that the logic of incarcerating someone for a deterrent purpose, there's no evidence to support it. So I think sometimes people fuse deterrence and retribution, or all these concepts kind of together, because they're all considered legitimate purposes: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. And there's a lack of coherent logic in our sentencing generally, because we sort of think it's just like a soup. But deterrence generally doesn't work, in part because a lot of crimes are impulsive, or what they call crimes of passion, like this one presumably, and people are not weighing up whether they're going to get the death penalty or whether they're just not. Thoughts?
It seems that deterrence theory is predicated on some sort of cost-benefit analysis. Can I do this bad thing that I want to do, and what's the likelihood of an adverse consequence if I do it? And I was a prosecutor for 22 years. Very few people went through that kind of thought process. But let me loop back to something you said. Credible risk of being caught and punished. Do you know if just the first one, a credible risk of being caught, independent of the sanction?
Yeah, it has a deterrent effect, because most people don't know what the sanction is going to be. They don't know. They don't walk around with a schedule of what they're going to get if they do this or that. So yes, it does have some deterrent effect, but it's for the most part, people are not deterred. And the reason I would say that is, if you look at, we have this experiment going on right now with mass incarceration, incarcerate more people than ever in the history of the world. We should have the safest society in the history of the world, right? And we don't, and for reasons we can discuss, but
it also seems, what was I going to say? Oh, this concept of general deterrence, that the punishment one person gets is going to deter others. The only way that works is if there's awareness or knowledge of the outcome. So unless you're a close watcher of what happens in court, it may have no impact at all. And I'm just not sure that human beings internalize the adverse consequence that happens to someone else. So, any thoughts about deterrence based on your earlier comment?
No, I agree with what you said. I mean, I just think it's been proven that it doesn't, for the individual and for society as a whole, that like fear or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't have an effect on people's behaviors.
Anyone in the back of the room maybe thoughts on deterrence? Professor types?
My whole class is trying to look at me right now. So one thought that I had while you were talking, Professor Sand and Professor Fox, about this calculus, right? And the fact that nobody is actually doing this calculus. If anything, I would say that they are doing a calculus of what I'm so desperate, what do I have to lose? And also, if I'm supposed to have, if there's supposed to be some sort of social contract where like we all in community and society behave a certain way, so that we all can be healthy and thrive, and I'm not healthy and thriving because I'm poor or whatever, like why would I agree to continue to engage in the social contract? So if anything, I'm doing a calculus of like, I'm desperate and also my needs are not being met in this society, and so I'm stepping outside the contract and I'm doing what I need to do to get my own needs met, whether that's making my home safer from an abusive parent or stealing food from the store.
And on that note, I think one of the interesting things about like that particular calculus is that if we were to take that into account, then someone who is desperate, their crime is much more rational or understandable than someone who is not desperate. So, but if you look at our laws, like for example, the felony threshold for theft is, I think they just raised it from 900 to 3,000.
Finally, oh my gosh, seriously? Like in Vermont?
Yeah, I think so. Wait, which is, first of all, arbitrary to begin with.
Yeah.
So like, let's just say it's 900. Somehow if you steal a $1,000 item, that is a much worse thing than a $400 item. And that's, I think that speaks to our emphasis on the sanctity of private property and stuff. But also, what if you're taking $1,000 from someone who doesn't need it versus someone who really needs it? Shouldn't it be based in part on the impact of the crime rather than the arbitrary number, because it might have a very different meaning in context. And so these kinds of things, they're not rational. They are in the sense that there's a cutoff under 1,000 or whatever over, but it's not based on any inherent logic, I don't think.
What all this also points out is that the things that might deter lawmakers, who really are the principal architect of our criminal legal systems, are very much removed from the day-to-day reality of people whose lives are far more challenging than most lawmakers. And so there's a substantial disconnect. So rumor has it we were supposed to talk about prisons.
Oh, right, yes, indeed. All right, well, so, so I think we've eliminated the idea of deterrence as a reason for incarcerating people, okay? So retribution, punishment, the idea, a retributivist says like, even if you don't want to, even if it's painful, as a society to do the right thing, you have to do a proportional punishment, just whatever that act deserves. So, they would say that if this guy killed his dad, then he should get some big honkin' prison sentence just as a way of sort of validating the value of the victim. And, but again, it's really subjective if you talk about what is justice in that case, or in many, many cases, right? And so, and I don't think that there's a valid rationale, or a valid defense of retribution. I don't think we're entitled to retribution. I don't, that's a moral claim, I guess, is what I'm saying, is that it's not just a strictly legal question, it's a moral claim that people will cite the Bible and things like that, but that is not a legal document, so. So we've eliminated at least deterrence, I would say. What prison is really good at is incapacitation, right? Which is a utilitarian reason for imprisoning someone. So you might say, look, this guy is dangerous, That's why we need to put him in, regardless of whether we're punishing him for, what it deserves, whatever, we can't decide what it deserves, so we just need to keep him away from the rest of us for X number of years. But, anybody have any sense of why that's potentially a problem?
Well, it's not a neutral place that they're putting them in. People are going to this place where they might be subject to further violence while in there, or be building up resentment and having been treated that way, and a whole bunch of other things, getting COVID, and then coming to the end of that time, reintegrating into society, but from a much worse off place than when they went in.
Right, but we don't care about that. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime, right? What percentage of people get out of prison that are put in prison? They are eventually released?
Like 90?
95%. So virtually everyone, right? And so to your point, yes, we can incapacitate someone for some arbitrary number of 20 years. Like, we think we need to be safe from this guy for 20 years, but then after that, we don't need to be safe from him anymore. So that might be an argument for life sentences. And why wouldn't we do that?
Can I go off script? Not that we really have a script, but that might have been obvious. What about then so-called second look legislation that says after X amount of time that someone has served on a long sentence, there's a revisiting that is separate and removed from the emotionality of the original sentence? Couldn't we preserve our prison system as long as we gave people that opportunity to get out early?
To show that they've rehabilitated?
Yeah.
Well, we've stopped doing that since the 1980s, really. It's decreased quite a bit. They give determinate sentences largely.
A fixed period of time.
Fixed period of time based on the idea that rehabilitation doesn't work or whatever. So, I mean, do prisons rehabilitate people by virtue of just being in the walls? Do you think people get rehabilitated?
That was historically, the penitentiary was designed to put people in isolation to repent.
Yes, and then they realized that made people go mad, right?
Indeed.
And so they kind of stopped doing that, and now we still do it. But rehabilitation, if rehabilitation worked by virtue of putting people in prison, we would have a lower recidivism rate than we do, which is, it's about 68% of people will be rearrested in 3 years. And that's way higher than Europe and places that have shorter sentences, and so I mean, rehabilitation, there's a lot of research that shows that rehabilitation can work. There's also a lot of research that shows that we don't invest in that anymore. And that it matters what kind and all that kind of stuff, but.
So what do we know about incarcerating people as a criminogenic risk factor, as a factor for further subsequent incarceration?
Yes, well, all things being equal, a prison sentence itself increases the likelihood that someone will commit crime. And there's a lot of debate, when they get out, and a lot of debate about why, right? So some people think that it has to do with the sort of feeling of illegitimacy of the system and rage that develops, and that can be part of it. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that once people are released, they face such obstacles and barriers, both in the form of legislated collateral consequences, and then stigma, and all the difficulties of just trying to get a job and a house and all the things that you know and can imagine, that success is very hard, and not that it's impossible, but it's like would be some kind of Herculean effort on a person's part that, to change their circumstances. And so that's one of the main reasons that just being in there is increases the likelihood of someone being reincarcerated or rearrested. And if you look at Europe, which has 5 times shorter sentences than we do, so if we would give someone 10 years in Europe, they would get 2 years. They have much better outcomes. So there's no evidence, back to the point of deterrence, that a harsh sentence or a long sentence does any good for, society, right? There may be other reasons to do it, but that is not one of them. Yeah.
Is there something to say about the surrounding infrastructure of a country like the United States as opposed to some of the European countries where maybe some of our more rehabilitative processes are not where they should be in terms of availability and effectiveness as opposed to European countries where healthcare is more available, psychiatric care is more available, drug rehabilitation programs? I mean, I'm not an advocate for imprisonment whatsoever, but it's hard to think of mass impact of alternatives as the system exists now.
Right. Yes, and it is very hard to compare U.S. prisons with European prisons and Nordic prisons, because of the fact that they have universal health care and they have universal child care and they have all these programs that are more supportive generally, especially of people who are, would be considered low income. And so if we had those things, it might be better. But of course, one of the arguments is against making our prisons too nice is the concern that judges, if you build it, they will come. The judges will say, well, I can let them go, but they're gonna just flounder in the community, so why don't I sentence them to incarceration where they can get treatment? And somehow that ends up being an argument for not offering treatment, but it's a no-win at the moment, like it seems to me, but.
So how many of you think that our criminal legal system, punishment, and our prison system is broken? The majority. So what do we do with an argument that Michelle Alexander and others have raised, that it's not broken, that it's doing exactly what it was set up to do? Think about the 13th Amendment that preserves slavery for people convicted of crimes. Convict leasing, we needed to replace the people who were emancipated. Jim Crow, the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: separate, marginalize, stigmatize, exacerbate class differences. And so I worry about whether little adjustments, incremental adjustments, how does that fundamentally change our perception? And going back to something you said before, a matter of philosophy, I don't know whether there's this innate human need for punishment or that's an innate human need for accountability. I think we have conflated accountability and punishment. And somehow, I don't know what the opposite of, we need to deconflate, separate those. Attorney Winter.
And I'm just dressed like this because of the oral argument we did. I don't usually dress like this, but I wanted to go back to the topic of incapacitation because that came up last week with Howard Zer's. We talked about, as someone who's very interested in abolition and reimagining what it looks like, to recognize that there's some violent crimes that, I'm thinking about domestic violence. I'm thinking also about someone who has grown up in a neighborhood that there's a high violent crime rate. The need of a temporary separation, and when we're reimagining what that could look like beyond incarceration, what could that be?
but also, you know, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts, like the need of, even if it's not, right, these crazy sentences that we see and that we criticize, but a temporary of like, okay, there clearly needs to be a break from this violent cycle that's happening. And what that, you know, what would be the other outlets that we could just like think about and move towards in addressing that need, I think that we can see sometimes in certain situations.
If we reimagine the question, I mean, so, you know, if what are prisons for, right? And if we, you know, if what we're trying to do is impact crime and reduce victimization, which I think somewhere along the line, that's what we're trying to do, then if we ask the question about how, I mean, first of all, how do we create well-being and healthy communities? Think about it as a public health issue. And there's, what's the author's name? Corsoni talks about that if you think instead in terms of like a public health model, you think about quarantining, right? So that you would take, you know, someone who is ill and quarantine them. So of course that could be just a euphemism where you're doing the exact same thing and just putting them away in isolation or something. But that part of his argument is that like what we're making the mistake of thinking is that we're overestimating people's willfulness in the sense of like their free will, they're just acting in the world, making bad calculations, being bad people, you know, and that if you look at things like disenfranchisement, the effects of poverty, the effects of racism, the effects of on brain development, for example, of neglect and abuse and things like that, that you know, that we're not all equally culpable. And so it's actually much worse for someone who had a really great childhood to do something than it is somebody who didn't, and by his argument. And so the you know, the idea would be, you know, what you're talking about, the temporary quarantine, but it would have to be completely different from what we do inside. I mean, part of it is that what we do inside is we let people languish and suffer and then put them in solitary when they decompensate, you know, mentally and emotionally. And then we put, you know, it's like, it's quite a system, but it's partly because we haven't built up the other infrastructures of mental health and, you know, things like that. So I think it's not just a euphemism, but I don't know exactly what it would look like, but it would be treatment, not punishment. I mean, you know, the punitive part getting mixed up in it is the part that really causes community damage in the long term. I don't know if that answers what you do.
Every time I think about prison abolition, and I think in my heart, I'm a prison abolitionist. In my head, though, I think about, so I prosecuted literally thousands of people. And of those thousands, maybe 5, I think, presented a present and ongoing risk of substantial harm to others. And I can't envision a system that doesn't have a way to separate those people. Now that's, you know, I'm terrible at math, but that is a tiny fraction of the number of people who we're sending to jails and prisons right now. And believe me, I would definitely do a whole lot of things differently if I could wind my career back. But do you have a vision for the people who present a present ongoing risk?
Well, it would be, you know, the quarantine treatment thing, and it'd be tiny. It'd be a very small, intensive treatment thing. The rest, a lot of people could be supervised in the community effectively if we had built up our community infrastructure. when you look at the incarceration rate, it was very stable from the 1920s to the 70s, right? We started calling a bunch more things crimes and saying that they needed 20-year sentences, and we started doing all these things. And even when crime went down, we still kept doing it. So we were somehow, that is just a cultural decision that we made to consider, to cast a wider net and call more things dangerous and so dangerous that we needed, or so bad that we needed to put people away. And there was a commissioner of corrections in Michigan, I can't remember her name, who had said we need to distinguish between who we're truly afraid of and who we're just mad at. And then I thought, oh my God, we incarcerate so many people that we are just mad at and exasperated by their behavior or outraged, but we don't have a way in our society to express that. Victims don't have a way to express that. The only tool we have at our disposal is the blunt instrument that is the criminal justice system and incarceration, right? So I think, I am an abolitionist, but what that doesn't mean, like, let's just open the doors and everybody run free. It's not that. You'd have to have a parallel process where you're building something else up. But I think if we did that differently and across systems and built up a mental health system and built up, basically poverty programs, we could affect even the number of people that we're mad at, I think. So years ago there were some studies, some pilot studies that did something where, like when somebody was coming out of prison, they usually give you like $200 gate money or something, versus they gave them, enough money for, I don't know what, to get an apartment, get stable, blah, blah, blah. And what do you think happened? The people who got money didn't recidivate at nearly the rate. So we know what it takes. We just don't have the political will to do it because it offends us, the idea of giving money to those people. And I get that, so, yeah.
So I'm just curious, thinking about this, like in that new theorized future, where would you put, or what would you do with people who have done like large-scale, systematic, like financial crimes, like Ponzi schemes that have impacted millions of people or tens of thousands of people and have ruined thousands of lives? Where would they fall under that new sliding scale of either recidivism or incarceration or something along those lines? Because I think a lot of this discussion has been around generally speaking, what most people assume crimes to be, impoverished people, maybe somebody getting shot or drugs or something like that. And that's where a lot of the conversation tends to be, for better or for worse. But I generally see that the people who are doing the most harm to society as a whole don't necessarily get engaged in these kinds of conversations. And so I'm just kind of curious where they might slot into this otherwise interesting, I think that the concepts that you're talking about are really interesting, but I don't know if there's necessarily been a place or a discussion around some of those larger players, for lack of a better word.
Well, this is where we could begin to talk about true accountability, right? What does true accountability look like? Prison or, a plea bargain doesn't really hold someone accountable. They don't even have to speak hardly, except to say yes, right? Yes. And so, there are other processes that could operate a restorative sort of process where people actually have to look people in the eye that they harmed and listen to what the impact is. And then, the other thing is there's ways in the community to make sure someone doesn't have an opportunity to recidivate, right? So that, those people don't get hired in, having access to passwords where they embezzle or whatever it is. There's ways within communities to try to put some guardrails on people. I mean, I have no idea how to deal with financial crimes, but I mean, it is interesting that the crimes that we punish are crimes of the poor, and that is why the conversation always goes there, and that is an interesting problem in itself. But what were you saying?
I think the outrage is not that the so-called bright-collar crimes are underpunished. It's that we dramatically, excessively punish everyone else, and so that contrast becomes even broader. Emily, I know you wanted to follow up.
No, but Liz, you can go first.
Okay.
Thank you. I think this should be pretty quick, but to me, the idea of punishment and associating that with prisons seems like a fundamental core of our society. And I think that stems from a moral belief of, like, when you're a kid, you're taught that if you do something bad, there's going to be a consequence. Do you think that idea needs to be shifted in society at large for true reform or true abolition in prisons to be accomplished? Or do you think that, I don't know, there's another means or another way forward to change our societal view of prisons and punishment?
I think we need a philosophical shift about what accountability is. So Kay Pranis, who's an internationally recognized restorative justice trainer, will be here in November. Stay tuned. What she says is that when talking about the indigenous roots to restorative practices, what she says is that every one of us have ancestors who sat in circle to resolve disputes at some point in our lineage. And we got away from that. And we got away from communities figuring out how to address harm and what the deficiencies are within communities that contribute. That's, some people might talk about transformative justice, looking at overall systems. We have come to associate accountability with punishment, and that, I don't know how we philosophically switch that, but that seems to me essential if we're gonna make dramatic change, because otherwise we are just tinkering. Not that those incremental changes aren't important, but it's a little bit like I used to think I was a progressive prosecutor because I asked for shorter periods of incarceration, but it was still buying into what I think is a flawed system. So I think it is, it has become how our brains think in this country, but I don't know that that's permanent.
And I think even in Europe and Scandinavian countries where they do shorter sentences, you know, that the logic is, I mean, in the nicer prisons in Scandinavia, the logic is that your punishment is having your liberty taken away, and so there's no reason to pile on, right? But they still believe in the idea that you should have your liberty constrained, but of course the thing that they do that's different than what we do is that then they try to spend that time, you know, improving their lot in life, right, and their chances beyond. I think for me, I think the hardest part is that, you know, people have understandable emotion about crime and about being victimized, and they don't know where to put it. So I think that, you know, if you try to convince people, as I do, that it's actually in everybody's interest to calm down and think about it more rationally about what is effective, what's evidence-based, what, you know, tends to work better in the long run. You know, that's not that satisfying when you're really, you know, worked up, and it's not a good political talking point either. And so I think that, you know, I try to say it's in your interest to actually be more, to destigmatize a criminal conviction, for example, and to try to welcome people back. I think it's in community's interest, and it's a risk, right? And we're very risk averse. So that I think is it's a hard sell. And my personal opinion is because I think we have understandable anger about being victimized or being harmed, and no process for expressing that.
Look, my spouse and I recently drove cross country, lots of billboards. I love the idea of calm down, people, as a big billboard. I think that would be outstanding. Who had a hand back there?
Well, again, this will be my last question. I don't want to take the last speaker, but
Did you
I
promise?
think that's a really good point. I think that's such a good point about the paradigm shift and like what can bring us closer to that. And I think maybe one, not the only answer, but one of them is like getting to experience an RJ process firsthand and like getting close to these stories, and that really does shift people's minds and hearts, I hope. But then I think about, the research you've done with COSA is like such an info.
Explain that.
So COSA, and you guys got this, I don't know. So COSA stands for Circles of Support and Accountability. I volunteered for one of them, but it was, and please just fill in the gap because I explained this wrong, but it was primarily for people who committed sex offenses in Vermont. I'm thinking about Vermont's program, but because it has expanded since, and it's really actually beautifully simple in the sense that it's at least a minimum of a year, and we call the person who was previously incarcerated the core member, and we have several community members and a staff person from their local CJC, and we meet once a week, and we're really just there to support and support and accountability, but it'll look very differently depending on the person and the circumstances, but it's just community like getting closer together and just being there, and it's quite informal, but I touch on it because I've like read your research on it, and I just was curious about like, given the lessons that you've learned from simple models like that that are extremely effective, like what are the lessons we can take away when we're trying to apply it from like different, bigger and like just different situations?
I love the question because just to step back from it, the paradigm shift, if people saw a restorative process, they would see the potential, and it's hard to imagine like another way. We're so ingrained, and our default is always punitive and always prison and everything. I also think everyone should visit a prison because we keep them very hidden, and that people, if they knew what prisons were like, I don't know. I mean,
How many of you have been?
Okay.
That's because they're all my students.
Every year.
Yeah.
Once a year.
And it's very powerful. And to your point about COSA, it could be COSA, it could be some other model. It's exactly what you said. It's simple. I always say it's simple but profound. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's just community building. And it's kind of like the Dismas House model, which is, if you know this, halfway house. It's about breaking bread, sharing a meal, right? Which is a very intimate, familial, supportive thing to do, right? You're sharing the same moral space as someone. And I think that the reason COSA is powerful is because it's support and accountability. And that's, we tend to kind of think that punishment is accountability and that we don't have to offer anybody support, that the punishment somehow is going to make them better. But that's only if deterrence works, and it doesn't. So it's just a flawed system from the beginning. So I think if there was, and also punishment is not accountability. So, and there's a great podcast called Making Amends, which is recorded in the Oregon State Penitentiary, and it's about all these guys doing long stints who are talking about how much they want to make amends, and that there are very few opportunities for them, and it's about how they construct meaning in this, really deprived environment. But So I think the reason COSA works, to the extent it works, is because it's regular people who are saying, yeah, I know you did this really bad thing, but that's not all you are. Let's think about what else you are or can be. And then, people are moved by that. And then they create these mutual obligations. It's an incredible thing. It's simple but great. Yeah. Alana.
I am gonna ask this as I'm exiting as a question prompt, but I hadn't thought about, we were talking about, sort of this, what I like to think of the hospicing rather than in binary of abolition and what that process looks like. And when you were framing the circles of support and accountability, it made me wonder what a SOSA system of support and accountability could look like if we really are looking at what really a reframing of these questions of justice and accountability would look like. And my question and concern is that if we only hold our systems accountable to think about what support and accountability could look like, but continue to only do that once someone has caused harm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So at what point could we think about a system of support and accountability? And are we ready and willing to do that earlier? Yeah. Or are we only willing to do that when someone's caused harm?
Well, prevention would be
Very, very dramatic. Mic drop.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope, you go.
Nope.
I was just gonna say, so I used to say in criminal law class that the most effective deterrent is hope, but actually I think Howard Zare, who wrote this famous book called Changing Lenses, said that the most effective deterrent is community. And if we dovetailing to what Alana said, if we reestablish the strength of communities and really thought about not leaving anyone in the community behind, I suspect we would dramatically impact the crime rate and the need for incarceration.
And if you think about her systems of support idea too, you would include victims in that process, right, or survivors, because they have needs. And one of the, it doesn't seem quite right that people would surround this person who did the harm, with all the support without also surrounding the person who experienced the harm. And making sure that their needs are met, because then you're actually leveling things somewhat. So
who has thoughts on how we get society or culture to envision a different approach to accountability?
One way to bridge Noah's comment and Emily's comment was bring these high level, high mortgage crimes into a context where you have them go to public housing and live on food stamps. But we actually do the opposite. So in terms of incremental steps we could take to transform, we can't abolish the prison system, but overnight. But we could, give felons public housing instead of denying them public housing. We could allow people to be on food stamps instead of denying access to food stamps. Reincorporate that support structure.
To say disenfranchising, there is no logical nexus between having committed a crime and your ability to vote. And it's classist, it's racist, it just pisses me off.
it's also a recipe for recidivism.
Right.
If you were trying to create a recipe for recidivism, that is what you do.
The sentence goes in.
Yeah.
So I guess to your question, I think the hardest part of trying to make people understand helping each other out and being accountable is that we've never seen that from a large scale. And this entire conversation, all I could think about, especially when Noe brought up white collar crimes, is that America itself has hurt so many communities and has yet to say sorry, especially thinking, because I'm Black, ADOS, I can't only think of the millions of people in America who've been screwed over after they've been dragged, their ancestors been dragged from their country, brought here, forced to labor, and then said, all right, kick rocks, basically. And I think thinking of that and never having like an actual like apology or trying to make sure their rights or the wrongs have been righted, because I mean, you can see we're winding back the clock of time with people rolling back history, basically, or trying to prevent students and kids in schools learning like actual American history. I think we've gotten to a point where it's like we will never see accountability or be able to be accountable in a large scale because we've never seen it, because our government itself has never been accountable for any of the harms it's done. And that's not just for Black folks in America. This is communities like the military doing radioactive or nuclear explosions out in the Pacific and harming the Pacific Islander people out there and causing so many problems. And then thinking of the natives in America, it's like, there's never been an apology or sorry. So I guess that's the hardest part for me, to see how we could be all accountable when we never have seen accountability.
Reminded of Daniel Serron's book, Until We Reckon.
Yeah.
You can't just ignore so-called first harm, the extermination and relocation of indigenous populations, second harm, slavery. And right, we have people, high-ranking officials trying to just completely ignore that. I've got to say, I think Vermont is not a bad place to try to exert some legislative leverage to account for Vermont's role in displacing people. And I know there is a former professor, Hillary Hoffman, is on a commission here to look at that. I thought VLGS could play a more active role, but I'm convinced this change doesn't happen until we have different people in the legislature, because I think the system is a system they've created. And it's very easy, and I certainly do it, to point fingers at law enforcement and corrections and prosecutors, but we're working within a legislatively created system, and that's where I think the principal change has to happen. Somebody, Chris.
I just want to expand on what you said. The legislators respond to the people.
Right.
So before that pressure happens, it has to come from us sitting here.
May I introduce you, folks? May I introduce you?
Oh.
Anyone who doesn't know, this is, you didn't answer, but I'm going to do it anyway. Chris Wood, who runs Bail.
Wait a minute.
Just off the green, and it's an excellent community space. We've done some storytelling there, and they have a host of other events, so check it out. Someone else had a hand up, I think.
I was gonna respond to what you were saying because I was thinking about that also, and I was just reading Usual Cruelty, and he says something interesting, and it was that if Germany imprisoned and disenfranchised as many Jews there as we imprison and disenfranchise people of color here, that there would just be like it would just be ridiculous, and people in Germany would revolt, and there would be this huge uprising because it's just unacceptable that they would be still doing that after World War II and after the concentration camps and all of that. And so if we think about it in that lens, it's really insane what we're doing without even recognizing it or having any sort of accountability.
Well, and when you think about Germany, they, it's illegal to be a Holocaust denier, and and they teach about the Holocaust in schools as a way of reckoning and making sure it never happens. I mean, it's like required. So they don't have whatever we have, which is let's just erase this and act like none of this ever happens. Yeah, it's horrifying.
Back in the 60s in New York City, tour buses used to go down into the village to look at all the hippies. And then the people on the street started lifting up mirrors, encouraging people to take a look at themselves. And that this country really needs to hold up a mirror and start taking a look at itself.
I think related to all of these things, what I think would help to shift us in the direction is anything that encourages people to start shifting into a more mindset of interconnectedness instead of individualism, which I think goes back way before just whoever our current legislators are to our founding documents that really enshrined individualism so highly. But if we could start thinking even selfishly that, what happens as a result of the people that we send to prisons then affects us and our communities would be a place to start, let alone the idea that, responsibility for everybody's having basic needs is all of ours.
Right. Are capitalism and communalism compatible, to use some alliteration? But,
The answer is no.
well, so
yeah, abolish prisons, yes, I would say yes, as they are now. But what we would build instead, I don't know, but.
That sort of leads to a question I was thinking about, just prison visits. Is it possible to have such reforms we're talking about in the same physical structure as prisons exist now? And I personally don't think so, but I think that is a huge undertaking for states to take, and I don't know, and I think finding that medium piece in between is sort of like seems to be a very large step that we haven't been able to take.
there's a restorative justice architect who's doing some design work for what a fundamentally different facility would look like. It'd be pretty hard. I mean, they're just so inhumane, but you could, even within the physical plan, things could be done very, very differently.
I think even reflecting back on my prison visit that I took with PP, the floor tiles, like it's ingrained, like the way the floor tiles are set up so that they can't be remembered. So that if somebody's walking from one place to another, they're like set up in such that they're not a pattern, so that they're inhibiting people from remembering where they were inside the building. And I think that those things you can't separate into the type of, structural reform that needs to be in place.
I mean, the whole logic of building, like that you need steel doors like this, and that you need people to be in, basically cages. There's a whole ideology built into that about who these people are or what they need or what we need to feel safe, and you would build something different. But one of the things that I am always shocked by is how similar prisons are to prisons 100 years ago. They've evolved very little in the thinking in terms of the design. I can't think of anything where we have evolved so little in 100 years.
Prisons in the criminal legal system.
Yeah.
Think about every other field.
Yeah.
Medicine, technology, science, huge changes. But
And also, we don't ask them to produce results that show success, right? We just keep saying, yep, let's just keep doing more of this. And instead of we need to fundamentally rethink what we're doing. And but I think that that's so daunting. And I will say that prisons are always having to deal with emergencies and stuff like that. But the environment, engenders some of that.
So I want to pick up on that and pick up on something that Emily said. There's a really interesting organizational and systems planning method called backcasting. And you think about 20 years from now, what's the system we want? And then you say, all right, what do we have to do in the next 10 years to get to that model? What do we have to do in the next 5 years? What do we have to do right now? Part of the problem when you talk about change right now is you get all these entrenched interests. So if you can divorce people from that and get them to envision a system 20 years from now, it then becomes potentially more attainable to think about what are the little steps now. Because otherwise, we're just maybe somewhat kicking the can down the road. Thought?
In a system that's so inherently political, though, where we have so much turnover every 4 years or so, I mean, how do you really plan for a system to exist in 20 years and have expectations that those plans are not muddled every couple of years?
It may well, but it lets people who aren't visionaries, who don't think past their hand, it forces them to envision a different system. And, you know, is that still gonna get distorted by political winds? Yes, but at least gets people envisioning something different. Final brilliant thoughts?
Oh, really?
What facilities, where have you done research?
I'm doing research right now in southern state, which is in your neck of the woods, and I spend a lot of time in the women's facility in Chittenden, just right near me. And I do, I teach restorative justice in there, and I do a bunch of volunteer stuff in there. But I've been doing prison climate surveys with staff and incarcerated. And the other thing I guess I would just mention is that the impact on staff who are, you know, presumably, you know, innocent. I mean, they haven't been convicted of a crime, right? They're regular people who are also impacted by that, by the conditions and environment in ways that are very negative for their health and well-being. And so that's another reason, I think, to rethink those. But let's see, parting wisdom. I would just say that I think that it would be really nice if judges had to say, this is the philosophy that I am sentencing on the basis of. This will meet this societal benefit. And here's the cost benefit analysis, and here's how I can justify it. And I think if they were required to do that rather than just defaulting to prison because it's, you know, the thing we do, I think that would be a really great start. And I think we need to give them more alternatives too, because there aren't existing alternatives if they don't want to just let somebody go, you know, so. How about you, parting wisdom?
I really like that idea of the private sector talks a lot about results-based accountability. The criminal legal system is almost completely devoid of that. We tend to reward, we certainly reward prosecutors who get long jail sentences. There's very little accountability for the actors who have designed and perpetuated the system.
Especially prosecutors.
Be nice to prosecutors. There's one or two that are good. Folks, thank you so much for coming.